Hey, what's up? I'm Ollie Efez. So right now, most of these websites, apps, digital experiences have adopted simple rules in their designs to make them as effective, efficient, and as beautiful as possible. And when I started to implement these into my designs, they changed my output drastically and my career trajectory for the better. So user experience is reason in combination with efficiency, which is also the amount of delight that's experienced by a user to complete their desired goal, whether that's physical, digital, or a combination of the two. Reason plus efficiency equals UX. But why should we personally care about these rules? I mean, it's not like I sit there reflecting on whether I've implemented Occam's razor or Fitts law into my designs. But when I reflect over something that I've created and tested, an artifact or a design, I normally find that success correlates to my usage of some of these rules, if not all of them. And they make designing that a little bit more easier because I can follow exact instructions or guidelines to creating a design. So I found an awesome site, which I'm not sponsored by or affiliated with, summarizing these rules, and it's called lawsofux.com. I want to thank them for the very clear definitions that they've provided on their website, which I'll be going into in length, as well as how you can apply them. So without further ado, first up is the aesthetic usability effect. This one's a little controversial to be first on the list because I know some people don't like the idea that an interface and an experience can in any way be related, but I'm not in that camp. The interface is what's surfaced to the user. So if there was only hypothetical experience design, there would be a lot of thought leaders, but products would never ship. So I don't know how many of you used crypto exchanges before 2020, hear me out. But damn, at times it felt like getting blood from a stone because I remember the initial shock of opening up a crypto website and seeing pretty much every red flag that you can in experience design. Everything pretty much screamed run, but the allure, obviously, of investing in something so new helped me to get through it. So this is an example of how the aesthetic usability effect was not in play, meaning it's not absolutely critical, but look at the exchange with the most amount of users and revenue that prevailed in the end. It was Coinbase. Their interface played a huge role in their adoption because it didn't look like every other exchange that you opened up. So it's not always those that are first to the party that get the cake. Metaphorically speaking, of course, because everybody would take the cake. And actually, an interesting component of this is that people even become more tolerant of usability issues when a design is more aesthetically pleasing. But don't confuse this with lots of usability issues. Among competing hypotheses that predict equally well, one with the fewest assumptions should be selected. So essentially, if you're looking to reduce complexity in the experience of the user when it comes to decision making with your product, aim to remove as much as you can from the interface, whilst maintaining the overall function of that specific goal. A lot of times this idea gets pushed too far in one direction or another. Either the business becomes obsessed with adding as much content to the page as possible because, well, more is better, right? What could possibly go wrong with this? Or design can have a habit of confusing efficiency with simplicity, and as a result end up removing vital functionality from a page. We're doing the user a favor because, well, less is more, right? This one is probably a little bit more subjective. I do have an entire video covering user experience frameworks if you want to check that one out. So just by simply being aware that this is a thing and trying to apply it to your work, you'll go a long way. Von Restorff effect. Predicts that when multiple similar objects are present, the one that differs from the rest is most likely to be remembered. It's also known as the isolation effect. Let's try a few examples and see what stands out to you. The von Restorff effect, it's about making key decisions visually distinctive in your experience. So a few things to consider here are that you don't necessarily want these things competing. You'll want to consider how accessible these things are for visual impairments. And also probably use caution when you're considering motion in your work. One, because of reasons of sensitivity, and two, because when people are trying to locate things efficiently in your product or your experience, you're adding more time for them to locate that important information. This rule also plays into the genius of some of the marketing campaigns for cars. For example, if I ask you to pick out a Tesla Cybertruck from a lineup of pickup trucks, if you've seen what one looks like and you're not super into cars, you'll probably have a lot more success than if I said to pick out a Ford F-150, for example. Think different. The law of similarity. The human eye tends to perceive similar elements in a design as a complete picture, shape, or group, even if they're separated, like a menu or a drop-down. We're used to seeing them everywhere, even if they're styled slightly differently. They're pretty similar. It's a list of navigational items or actions, but sometimes they need to be grouped into different types of actions. Look at Google Sheets. They do a few things to achieve this. First, they have a navigation with a pretty prominent hierarchy on the page. I mean, it's close to the top, and it's grouped together so we know immediately that they're important and they're related somehow. Also because of their similar font styling. So if we click insert, then out pops a list which is split into 5 different sections. How do I know this? Because there's a thin grey divider separating them. We've got the first group, which are all related to cell editing. The second group has more illustrative inserts. Then we've got formulas and links, interactive items, and commentary. And when I hover, there's a subtle darkened area. Again, creating another layer of grouping in my head, as well as turning it from a passive UI element into an action. But circling back to the law of similarity, all of these things are insertable into a spreadsheet, as it states. So they're separated in one way because of the dividers, but they're connected in another because of the card behind it, and also the proximity to one another. And when I hover over another item, they disappear. So in my head, again, they can't be related. Miller's law. The average person can only keep 7 plus or minus 2 items in their working memory. So in the previous rule, I gave an example of when we're in Google Sheets and I hover over a menu item, and when I change the item, it will also hide the previous one and show a new one. It's subtle and pretty much second nature to design menu items like this in this way. The reason behind this is because it would be pretty pointless to just show every list active at any one time and ask the user to choose. The user can't read and assess an appropriate action when they're presented with so many options to choose from. This is also related to cognitive overload. So your brain can only process so many things at any given time. So don't make your users' lives harder than they have to be. If you can get your message across by displaying less than 7 items at one time, the more likely you'll get the desired outcome that you're after. I'd recommend not requiring users to remember anything from session to session or from screen to screen. Develop states and a retentive memory in the experience itself. Fitts law. The time to acquire a target is a function of the distance to and the size of the target, also known as touch targets. So these are things that users have to physically interact with. Think of buttons, lists, menu items, fields. Essentially, design an experience in a way that minimizes the amount of time it takes to perform actions. This comes down to 2 things. So the size of a target and the distance from your current position, whether that's a mouse click, a tap on your phone, a swipe, an eye movement in VR. Imagine if YouTube put the subscribe button way over here, for example, and made it tiny. Firstly, that would be pretty funny, but it would also be a lot harder to subscribe to this channel. So by getting feedback in your work, it can go a long way here to improving the user experience. So in general, people tend to struggle more with smaller buttons and call to actions because at a glance, they're harder to spot. And when you consider the medium too, a thumb is wider than a mouse. So I think it's important to consider this and leave as little room as possible to second guessing when it comes to whether or not the user has actually clicked or tapped. Jacob's law. Users spend most of their time on other sites, so this means that users prefer your site to work the same way as all the other sites that they've used. So aside from the few exceptions that you use daily, like big tech platforms or email, users are likely not going to be venturing to the far corners of the web using these obscure platforms to do what they need to do. Unless it's browsing a feed for entertainment, people want to spend as little time on and have as little friction as possible when completing these tasks. Even things like shopping, you might spend a little time picking, but if you already knew exactly what you wanted, you wouldn't need to. And when you're paying for these items, these sites are using the most optimized, tested merchants that are available because they do not want issues when it comes to paying for the item especially. These merchants are actually a great example of users getting used to an experience and expecting it from yours. The Stripe effect. Stripe has taken over financial checkouts because they're the easiest to use. If you're designing your own checkout process and stray too far from the Stripe effect, because of how ubiquitous it has now become, you might get some friction because as of right now, it's a pretty standard layout for payments. Okay, away from payments for a second, let's say you are a big social network. A few years ago, Reddit underwent one of the largest experience changes from any social network ever, because quite frankly, it was awful for newcomers, but needs must. But with all the content on the site and the structure that people were used to seeing, they had to approach this dilemma with the utmost care. So what did they do? Well, once they had the complete redesigned experience, they allowed the user to toggle whether or not they wanted to use it. With such a huge overhaul, They had to minimize discord by empowering the user to continue with what they were familiar with for a limited time, slowly get them used to a new UI, and then set the expectation that it will change at a later date for everyone. And it worked. It was an awesome transition and incredibly well executed to their credit. So they made the new Reddit what they already know, which ties back into Jakob's law. Combine that with the fact that every other platform had already gone in this direction when it comes to a conventional layout, it was a no-brainer. Postel's law: be liberal in what you accept and conservative in what you send. Oh man, passwords. Actually, this applies to many areas, but regarding input fields specifically, I can best demonstrate this. Never, ever underestimate your user. Ever. There's so many different variables that come into play when interacting with something online. You've got background, profession, language, security, and sometimes just straight up trolling. I've seen so many instances online and in memes where people are trying to create passwords and they can't because of all these criteria and requirements. So in your designs, try to aim to remove as much friction as possible whilst still conforming to the best security practices that you can. The same applies to payments again. When you're entering card details, sometimes it's not so clear whether you should add a space or a dash in the entry fields. So again, design tolerance into your system and try and be liberal in what you accept. So obviously rules can be broken, but I'd stick to them for the most part, especially if you're just getting started in the industry. And so by implementing these 8 different rules into your design, you too can be on your way to design pretty much anything. And as a result, you should see a lot more success when it comes to the user experience of your products. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll catch you later.